Hands where I can see them. Get on the ground now!
I'm not going anywhere. You hear me?
Before we start the story, tell me, where are you watching from? And if these stories speak to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Texas heat got a way of cooking everything that sits still too long. People, patience, even pride. That afternoon, the highway shimmered like glass, air so thick it bent light. General David Cross eased his black SUV onto the shoulder just outside Pine Creek, the kind of town that measured respect by badge count. He'd been driving 6 hours from Fort Bliss, trying to reset his GPS after it started spitting directions like it lost its mind. Simple stop, 5 minutes, maybe less. But nothing stays simple when your skin says something your uniform never could. Behind him, a cruiser rolled up slow, lights flashing lazy, no siren, like a cat that already caught what it came for. Officer Karen Doyle stepped out, mirrored shades, hiding eyes that didn't need much hiding. She had that stance, hip tilted, hand near her belt, mouth already loaded with judgment. License and registration, she barked before she even reached the window. No greetin', no reason. David lowered the glass halfway, voice smooth, like he was still at a briefing. Afternoon, officer. Just recalibrating my GPS. She didn't like the calm in his tone. Calm meant control, and control was hers by habit. You can't just park on state property, sir. That sir came out shaped like an insult. He nodded once, polite. Didn't realize this stretch was restricted. Give me a second to step out of the vehicle, she cut in. Sunlight bounced off her badge, glinting right in his eyes. He paused, small breath, measured. In combat, you learned when silence saved more than speech. He opened the door slow, hands visible, posture steady. No tension in his face, but the air around him had changed. Even the cicadas went quiet. She circled him like she was searching for guilt that hadn't shown up yet. What's in the back? Equipment, he said. Military issued. I'm authorized to transport it. Her eyebrows rose. Military, huh? You got ID for that? He smiled, not the friendly kind, the tired kind. Plenty. He reached toward his inside pocket slow enough to draw a picture. Pulled out a leather wallet with gold insignia gleaming faintly. The reflection hit her shades. She stepped back. For a second, hesitation cracked her posture. Then pride patched it up. Anybody can buy pins online, she said, shrugging. He studied her, voice lower. Ma'am, I've worn this uniform 30 years. My name's General David Cross, United States Army. You can confirm that before we waste each other's afternoon. She folded her arms. Don't tell me how to do my job. That's the thing about some power. It needs to prove itself even when nobody's arguing. The asphalt sizzled under their feet, the kind of heat that makes tempers sweat through the skin. David kept his gaze straight, not challenging, not submissive either. Every breath he took was discipline. Inside, he remembered every lecture he'd given about restraint, every soldier he'd calmed when anger came easier than survival. Now, he was the lesson. She leaned in closer than protocol allowed, breath sharp with arrogance. You act like you're somebody, she said. He answered soft, I don't have to act. That line hung there between them, invisible but heavy enough to bend the air. Down the highway, an 18-wheeler roared past, wind whipping dust between them. She flinched. He didn't move. That stillness made her uneasy. Look, she said, forcing authority back into her throat. Why don't you call whoever you need to call? He tilted his head, like he'd just realized what kind of test this was. Then he spoke into the small mic clipped inside his collar, a habit he never dropped, even off base. Cross to command. Just a signal check, he said, tone casual. Somewhere far away, a reply crackled faint through static. Copy, Cross. Signal received. Karen blinked, unsure if she'd imagined it. Who was that? Someone who listens, he said. She frowned. Excuse me? He didn't answer, he just looked past her, toward the endless road shimmering like a mirage, and the sound of another set of engines growing nearer. The dust rose first, then dark vehicles appeared on the horizon, sleek, black, too well kept for county issue. Karen's hand dropped instinctively from her belt. David didn't gloat. He just adjusted his collar like a man whose patience had an audience now. She cleared her throat. Is some kind of joke? He finally looked back at her. No, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding that's about to get cleared up. She tried to smile, but it came out brittle. You could have just told me who you were. He exhaled slow. I did. You just couldn't hear it through what you thought I was. The new engine slowed, rumbling deeper than patrol cars ever could. Karen swallowed hard. Her reflection in his sunglasses, showing a woman realizing she'd been the story all along. David turned slightly, sunlight catching the faint silver in his hair. Every inch the soldier who'd seen enough battles to know when to stand still. And as that convoy drew closer, the line between authority and accountability started melting in the Texas heat, just like everything else that day. Heat sits on the highway like it's alive, pressing on skin, on nerves, on pride. The dark SUVs haven't fully stopped yet. They're still crawling in, slow and deliberate, but the sight alone changes the air. Officer Karen Doyle steps back half a pace before she even realizes it. Pride catches her, jerks her forward again. She adjusts her stance, hand still hovering near her belt. She wants to look like she's in charge. The problem is, everyone can see she isn't. General David Cross watches her the way you watch a thunderstorm. Calm, analytical, waiting to see where the lightning's gonna strike. Sweat rolls down his temples, but his face doesn't twitch. Officer, he says, quiet and even. I'd appreciate it if you lowered your voice. It's not a demand, just a fact stated by a man who's used to being obeyed. Doyle tilts her chin. You don't tell me what tone to use, sir, she snaps, stretching that sir like gum until it breaks. She circles him again, making a show of inspection. You think you can call a few fancy friends and scare me? He doesn't answer. He's been trained to let silence do the work. That silence crawls up her back, makes her talk more. See, this is what happens when folks like you think the rules don't apply. She gestures toward the SUVs, now rolling to a stop at the edge of the shoulder. Who are these people anyway? The SUVs stop in perfect symmetry. Doors open at the same time. Two men in dark suits stepping out first. They don't run. They don't shout. They walk like the ground already belongs to them. Doyle straightens, suddenly aware of how her uniform looks under the harsh light. Ma'am, one agent says, voice crisp. We're responding to General Cross's call. You can step aside. He doesn't raise his voice either, but there's something final in the way he says it. Doyle laughs once, too loud. General? You're kidding. She looks at Cross. That true? You're telling me you're actually military brass? He nods once. Yes, ma'am. I gave you my name earlier. Her laugh cracks halfway through. So you expect me to believe some high-ranking officer just happens to be on the side of my road? Cross keeps his gaze steady. I expected you to believe what you saw in my wallet. She opens her mouth, closes it again. The men in suits exchange a look, one subtle eyebrow lift that says they've seen this before. Someone's authority shrinking in real time. Behind them, another vehicle rolls up. Matte gray sedan, no markings, tinted windows. The door opens and a tall black woman in a blazer steps out, ID badge glinting at her belt. Federal Inspector. Her tone is gentle, but carries an edge that cuts through the heat. Officer Doyle, right? We've had reports of a stop gone wrong. You mind explaining why you detained a federal officer without cause? Doyle starts talking fast. Procedure, suspicion, the whole grab bag of excuses. Every word tangles itself. Cross stands still, hands folded in front of him, letting her own voice bury her. When she finally runs out of sentences, the inspector simply writes something on a pad and says, "We'll handle the review." No argument, no anger. Just bureaucracy closing its fist. That's when the humiliation starts to bloom. Not in the yelling or the paperwork, but in the quiet. The local radio chatter goes silent. The highway, once hers, now feels foreign. The other officers from her precinct arrive too late, stop at a distance, pretending to be occupied with traffic cones that don't exist. Everyone's pretending. She feels the cameras she can't see, the ones in phones somewhere behind car windows. Cross looks at her once more, finally breaking the stillness. "You ever think about what respect means, officer?" he asks, almost kindly. She swallows hard, unsure if it's an insult or a lesson. "Respect?" she repeats, forcing a smirk. "Sure, it's earned." He nods. "Exactly." Venny walks past her toward the inspector's car, the black SUVs forming a quiet escort. For a moment, she stands alone, the sun stabbing her eyes. Her throat burns with a mix of heat and humiliation. She whispers to herself, "He's not supposed to matter more than me." But the words sound hollow even to her. The inspector finishes a few calls, then turns to Doyle. "You'll need to surrender your body cam and report back to headquarters." Doyle stiffens. "Am I suspended?" The inspector doesn't answer. That's silence again, the same kind that Cross used. Says everything. As the convoy pulls away, dust curls up behind the tires. Doyle's reflection appears in the SUV's tinted window for a split second. She looks small, washed out, like a person watching her own authority disappear down the road. David Cross, inside the car, exhales for the first time in 20 minutes. He isn't smiling. His hands rest flat on his knees. The agent in the passenger seat says, "You all right, sir?" Cross nods. "I'm fine. Just tired." He looks out the window at the receding figure of the officer. That uniform used to mean something. The agent glances over. Yours still does. Cross doesn't reply. He just watches the highway unspool in front of them. Sun glaring so bright, it blurs the line between sky and road. Back at the shoulder, Officer Doyle kicks at the dust. Her radio buzzes. Someone asks if she needs assistance. She clicks it off. There's nothing left to say. She feels the burn of embarrassment spreading through the department already. Imagines her name in tomorrow's report. She whispers, "It was just a stop." But deep down she knows it wasn't. It was exposure. A mirror she didn't ask for, but can't look away from. The humiliation isn't in losing the argument. It's in realizing there never should have been one. She stares after the convoy until the shimmer of heat swallows it. Then she walks back to her cruiser, sits inside, and for the first time in years, doesn't trust the badge on her chest to mean what she thought it did. Far down the road, the SUVs merge onto the highway toward Fort Bliss. The inspector rides silent beside Cross. The air conditioning hums softly, but the general keeps the window cracked, letting the Texas air mix with the sterile cool. "You handled that well," she says finally. Cross shakes his head. "I handled it quiet," he answers. "That's different." They drive in silence a while longer, the landscape stretching endless and empty Behind them, Pine Creek fades into a heat mirage, a dot on the map that just learned how fast truth can travel. The road stretched out like a long breath nobody wanted to release. Inside the federal convoy, the hum of engines replaced the noise of confrontation. General David Cross sat in the back seat, shoulders square, but eyes far away. He'd worn that expression before. After deployments, after ceremonies, the look of a man cataloging what just happened so he can explain it later without emotion. Only this time, there was no battlefield to blame. There was only home. The inspector riding beside him scrolled through her tablet. Already, notifications stacked up. Incident reports, body cam timestamps, the words unjustified detainment blinking in black and white. She spoke softly. "It's going viral, sir." Someone driving by caught everything on their dashcam. Cross didn't answer. He watched telephone poles sliding past the window like metronomes, keeping time with his pulse. He wasn't angry. Anger burned too fast. He was disappointed in a way that settled deep, the kind that made your hands tremble hours later. He thought about every soldier he'd ever mentored, telling them discipline means holding yourself steady when respect disappears. Now he wondered if any of them could have stayed that calm on the side of a Texas highway. Back in Pine Creek, Officer Karen Doyle sat alone in the station briefing room, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects. Her uniform still carried the smell of asphalt and heat. She scrolled her phone. Comment sections were already flooding with her name. Half the department pretended not to stare through the glass wall. When the chief walked by, he didn't stop. He just said, "Internal Affairs at 0800. That was it. No pep talk. No defense. She looked down at her badge. The shine had dulled somehow, though she hadn't touched it. For the first time, she noticed how heavy it felt pinned to her chest. Out on the highway, state troopers were rerouting traffic around the patch of shoulder where it happened. The asphalt still held faint footprints and tire marks, like a chalk outline of pride and protocol. Reporters had already arrived, lining up in the grass with microphones, all saying the same thing in different tones. An altercation between a police officer and a decorated U.S. Army general is under federal review. Every word sounded sanitized, but under the polish, people could hear the raw story. At Fort Bliss, soldiers watched the clip between drills. No commentary, just silence, the kind that carries its own language. Some muttered disbelief. Others shook their heads like they'd seen it coming. A young private whispered, "That's General Cross, man. He trained half the base." No one replied. What could they say? They'd been warned about civilian encounters. Keep calm, keep identification ready. But the video showed something training never covered. How invisible rank becomes when bias walks in the room first. Inside the convoy, the inspector finally broke the quiet. "You know this will turn political by morning." Cross nodded. "It already is." She hesitated. "They'll ask for interviews. You could use this moment." He turned toward her. "Use it for what? To prove I'm still human?" The bitterness in his tone surprised even him. He sighed, straightened his posture again. "Ma'am, every time this happens, they call it a moment. I've lived long enough to know moments fade. What matters is what stays written after." The convoy reached the base gate. Guards saluted, but their eyes carried questions. Cross stepped out, the desert wind catching the edge of his jacket. He walked across the parade ground toward his office. Every step echoed against concrete, like punctuation to a sentence nobody wanted to read aloud. Inside, His aide had already printed the preliminary report. He skimmed the lines, each one more clinical than the last. Subject detained. Officer asserted probable cause. Federal identification verified. He set the paper down gently. So clean, he murmured. No mention of tone, of eyes, of assumption. The aide said quietly, "We all saw it, sir. The camera caught enough." Cross gave a half smile. Cameras see light. They don't see history. Night fell over Pine Creek, neon signs flickering on the main street. At the diner, locals argued over coffee refills. Some said the general overreacted. Others said the cop embarrassed the whole town. The waitress just kept pouring, pretending not to listen. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion was louder than the facts. Karen Doyle drove past the diner on her way home, watching their mouths move behind the glass. She couldn't hear, though, but she didn't need to. She knew her name was on their lips. Her radio crackled with dispatch chatter about administrative leave. She turned it off and drove in silence, streetlights cutting across her windshield like a slow confession. Meanwhile, the Pentagon lit up with late-night emails. Public relations teams drafted statements. A colonel sent one simple line to every branch commander. Respect between services and civil authorities remains paramount. No drama, no anger, just the quiet language of bureaucracy, trying to mend something it didn't build. Cross stayed in his office until midnight. He watched the same clip replay on mute. Without sound, it looked almost peaceful. Two people in the sun, one pointing, one standing. If you didn't know the context, you'd miss the storm behind it. He wondered how many other storms had passed unseen because nobody had been filming. He remembered soldiers who told him stories after deployments, stories he hadn't wanted to believe, because belief meant admitting the uniform didn't protect everyone equally. Now he couldn't unsee it. Back in town, Doyle sat at her kitchen table, uniform folded on the chair beside her. Her reflection in the dark window looked older. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She didn't answer. A text followed. "Officer Doyle, this is Internal Affairs. Report at 0800. No greeting, no comfort." She typed a reply, then deleted it. Her hands shook. She whispered to herself, "I was just doing my job." The words didn't land. They hung in the air like smoke with nowhere to go. By dawn, every major network carried the headline: "Racial profiling alleged in detainment of U.S. Army general." The photo they used showed Cross standing beside his SUV, sunlight cutting across his face. It looked heroic, almost staged, but he remembered how hot the air had felt, how small that patch of highway had seemed. Now, the world was calling it a symbol. At the base gate that morning, soldiers saluted sharper, voices lower. Respect had turned into something else, a mix of pride and protectiveness. Cross nodded to each of them, grateful but uneasy. He didn't want to become a headline. He wanted to remain a leader. Yet he understood why symbols matter, because people listen to symbols longer than they listen to warnings. Back in Pine Creek, reporters crowded outside the precinct. Doyle walked past them without speaking. Flashbulbs popped. Microphones followed. Someone shouted, "Do you regret your actions?" She kept walking, eyes fixed ahead. Inside, the chief handed her a sealed envelope. Administrative leave, effective immediately. He didn't meet her gaze. When she sat in her car afterward, she saw her reflection again, a uniform blurred by tears she refused to wipe. For the first time in her career, she didn't know whether she was angry at the world or herself. Across the state, commentators debated the same question. What does accountability look like when bias hides behind procedure? For Cross, The realization came quietly, while watching the sunrise over the base. Change wouldn't come from outrage. It would come from repetition, from making this story impossible to forget. He turned to his aide. "Set up a meeting with public affairs," he said. The aide hesitated. "You planning to speak?" Cross nodded. "Not about me, about respect." Outside, the sky lightened into soft gold, and for the first time since the stop, he allowed himself a long breath. Realization, he decided, wasn't about understanding what happened. It was about refusing to let it happen quietly again. By the third morning, the story had already grown bigger than Pine Creek. Every major network ran a version of it, each with the same still frame. The sun-bleached highway, the silver-haired man standing calm beside his SUV, the officer half turned toward him, frozen in the act of authority. Cable anchors called it the stop on Route 17. Commentators filled hours arguing over what the video did or didn't show, but the real story was playing out in two very different rooms, one in the Pentagon's gray marble halls, the other in a cramped internal affairs office that smelled like stale coffee. In Washington, General David Cross sat at the end of a long table, surrounded by uniformed peers and civilian advisors. The screens behind them replayed the roadside footage on mute. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Finally, a colonel said, "It's clear you handled yourself professionally, sir." Cross didn't nod. "Professionalism shouldn't have to look like restraint from humiliation," he answered. The words landed heavy. A civilian aide whispered that the secretary wanted a statement drafted before the evening brief. Cross looked out the window at the pale DC sky. "Then make sure the statement isn't about me," he said. "Make it about what uniform means." At the same hour in Pine Creek, Officer Karen Doyle faced two investigators across a metal table. The younger one read from notes, voice flat. "Officer, did you recognize General Cross's identification when presented?" She clasped her hands, knuckles white. It looked unofficial. People fake credentials all the time. The older investigator raised an eyebrow. "And you believe detaining him was necessary?" She hesitated. "Protocol requires compliance until verification." "Protocol doesn't require humiliation," he said quietly. She flinched at the word. The recorder on the table clicked louder than before. Outside, protesters had begun to gather on the courthouse lawn. Some carried homemade signs. "Respect the uniform. Justice for Cross." Others simply stood in silence. Veterans mostly. Their posture saying more than chance could. A local news drone hovered overhead, its reflection glinting off parked cars. Reporters called the movement the Stand Down Rally. Back in D.C., the press conference room buzzed like a hive. Cross stepped up to the podium wearing his service coat, ribbons gleaming against the muted blue backdrop. Cameras flashed. He didn't look at them. He looked through them, as if speaking to someone far beyond the lenses. 3 days ago, he began, I experienced what many Americans experience far too often, being measured by appearance before being spoken to. The room stilled. I want to be clear, this isn't about anger, it's about expectation. We expect fairness from those sworn to uphold it. And we earn that fairness by remembering that respect is not a courtesy, it's a duty. He paused. That duty was missing on Route 17. When he stepped away from the microphone, the reporter shouted questions, but he kept walking. The clip aired worldwide within the hour. In Pine Creek, Doyle watched it from her couch, remote limp in her hand. The general's calm voice filled her living room. She muted it halfway through, but his words stayed. On the coffee table lay her badge, the edges catching the afternoon light. She realized how small it looked without the uniform behind it. A text came from her partner on patrol. "They're putting your cruiser on hold. Chief says don't come in." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned up the sound again, just as Cross's voice said, "We earn that fairness." The next morning, talk shows filled with former officers dissecting policy, psychologists discussing bias, politicians promising swift review. None of it moved Cross. He sat in his office, rereading emails from soldiers, some grateful, some angry that he'd been disrespected, all calling him sir. One message stopped him. "I'm 19, black, and serving overseas. You showed me how to stand tall when they look down on us. Thank you." He stared at the line for a long time, then forwarded it to Public Affairs with a note. "File under why this matters." By midweek, Pine Creek's mayor issued a formal apology. It sounded rehearsed, but the words racial profiling appeared in print for the first time in town history. The department's website crashed under traffic from people demanding transparency. An anonymous insider leaked part of Doyle's report. 3 sentences stripped of emotion, but heavy with implication. Subject was calm and articulate. "I maintained control of the scene." The internet seized on that phrase. Memes, tweets, late-night monologues, all repeating "maintained control." It became the symbol of what went wrong. Doyle's father, a retired sergeant, called that evening. "You need to apologize publicly," he said. "Admit what happened." She snapped. "You think they'd forgive me?" He sighed. "It's not about forgiveness. It's about facing it." When the call ended, she sat in darkness. Phone screen fading to black. Outside, a handful of reporters waited under the streetlight. She drew the curtains. Meanwhile, the Pentagon released its official statement. The Department of Defense reaffirms its commitment to mutual respect between military and civilian law enforcement. The incident involving General Cross is under review. Clean. Careful. But paired with his earlier speech, it read like an indictment written in diplomacy. Civil rights groups quoted it verbatim. Commentators said Cross had shifted the conversation from outrage to reform. He didn't plan it that way. He'd only told the truth and let people decide what to do with it. By the weekend, the base held a small ceremony, honoring veterans of community service. Cross attended quietly, sitting among families instead of the front row. When the master of ceremonies called his name, the crowd stood. The applause wasn't for rank, it was for composure. He nodded once, humbled and weary. Afterward, a young reporter approached. "General, what would you say to Officer Doyle if you saw her again?" He thought for a long moment. "I'd tell her power's a mirror," he said. "Sometimes you don't like what it shows, but you can't pretend it's not yours." Back in Pine Creek, Internal Affairs concluded its report. Suspension recommended, mandatory retraining. The chief delivered the news personally. Doyle listened without protest. When he finished, she said quietly, "I thought I was doing everything right." He shook his head. "That's what makes it worse." That night, rain finally broke the heat. She stood on her porch, uniform packed away, listening to thunder roll over the fields. The water on her face could have been rain or regret. She didn't check which. Across the country, Cross watched the same storm front crawl east on the weather radar. For the first time all week, he allowed himself a faint smile. Storms cleanse, he thought, even when they flood. The exposure was complete now. Names, faces, timelines, all public. The noise would fade eventually, as all news does. But something underneath had shifted. Pine Creek would write new training manuals. Cadets would study the stop on Route 17 as a cautionary case. And somewhere down that same highway, the asphalt still shimmered in the heat, holding the memory of a day when the balance of respect tilted, just long enough for the world to notice. Morning news anchors didn't need introductions anymore. The clip had become its own headline. The stop on Route 17 ran on every channel, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed until the frame lines blurred. By dawn, it wasn't just a Texas story. It was America arguing with itself again. In Houston, veterans marched carrying folded flags. In Atlanta, college students filled courthouse steps. In Denver, a group of cadets held signs that read, "Respect is rank enough." Hashtags kept multiplying, small digital bonfires spreading across the timeline. Every scroll showed the same contrast: Cross standing still, Doyle mid-command, the sky burning white behind them. At Fort Bliss, the phones rang nonstop. Journalists wanted quotes, politicians wanted proximity, and Cross wanted none of it. He stayed behind his desk, listening to the hum of the bass loudspeaker announcing morning formation. He'd spent 30 years teaching soldiers that restraint was strength. Now the world had turned his restraint into a spectacle. His aide entered holding a tablet. "Sir, the Secretary's office wants to know if you'll appear before the Committee on Policing Relations." Cross rubbed his temple. "They need testimony, not theater," he said. "If I go, I'll speak about respect, not ratings." The aide hesitated. They're expecting emotion. Cross looked up. Then they'll get honesty. That's louder. In Pine Creek, outrage didn't feel abstract. It had faces pressed against glass. Reporters camped. The chief had stopped defending her. Even her closest colleagues answered with clipped nods. The town council issued statements about community healing, but everyone knew it meant reputation damage. At the grocery store, an elderly woman muttered as Doyle passed, "Thought y'all were supposed to protect people." Doyle didn't respond. The weight of every camera flash from that day still lived behind her eyes. She had replayed the stop 100 times, trying to find the second she could have changed it. There was one, the moment she mistook his calm for defiance. Pride had done the rest. Nationally, the debate split open. Talk show tables filled with uniforms and suits. One commentator said, "This isn't about a bad apple. It's about a system trained to distrust dignity." Another shot back, "You're politicizing a procedural error." The shouting didn't matter. What stuck were the quiet moments, families at breakfast, watching the footage in silence. Veterans, turning off the TV halfway through because they'd seen that look before. Cross avoided interviews, but couldn't avoid consequence. Letters poured in from soldiers, parents, even children, drawing him in crayon beside a patrol car. One note read, "You didn't shout. You didn't need to." Another simply said, "Thank you for not letting anger be the only story." He kept those on his desk, paper anchors holding down the chaos. Still, he knew outrage had a half-life. It flared fast, faded faster. What mattered was what the flare lit up before darkness returned. The Army's Public Relations Division suggested creating an initiative on civilian-military understanding. Cross agreed, but only if he could lead it quietly. No slogans, he told them. Just conversations. They titled it Project Common Ground. Within a week, cadets were hosting roundtables with police academies. Cameras showed up anyway, but the footage looked different. Uniforms sitting side by side instead of squared off. For once, outrage built something. Meanwhile, Doyle faced her own version of public fury. The department's email flooded with complaints. Her suspension became official. Badge turned in, weapon locked away. At home, she scrolled through comments until the words blurred into static. Some messages were cruel, some reflective. One simply asked, "When did fear become your first command?" That one she couldn't shake. Her father stopped calling for a week. When he finally did, his voice was small. "You can still learn from this," he said, "if you let yourself." She wanted to believe him, but humility and habit rarely shared the same room. A week later, Congress called for hearings. Cross sat before microphones again, the seal of the United States glowing on the wall behind him. Lawmakers leaned forward, pens ready for quotes. "General," one asked, "how do we restore trust between communities and enforcement?" Cross clasped his hands. "Start by defining respect as policy, not personality," he said. "Train authority to listen before it commands. And remember, silence under humiliation isn't peace. It's exhaustion." The room fell quiet long enough for the stenographer's keys to echo. Those lines aired that night across every network, replayed over and over, stripped of military polish, spoken like a teacher tired of repeating the same lesson. Outrage kept its rhythm. Protests remained peaceful but firm, candles lining courthouse steps instead of fists in the air. Churches opened halls for dialogue circles. Police chiefs from other counties called Pine Creek asking for policy templates. Change, the slow kind, began to take shape, not born of apology, but of exhaustion with excuses. Doyle eventually agreed to a media interview. The camera lights made her squint. She chose her words carefully, each one heavier than the last. "I misread a situation," she said. "I let pride and fear talk louder than reason. I see that now." The anchor asked if she thought she deserved forgiveness. She paused. "I think forgiveness belongs to the people I disrespected. My job is to become someone who earns it." The clip aired that evening, and though comments remained divided, something in her voice, tired, honest, shifted the tone. People stopped calling her monster and started calling her mirror. Cross watched the interview from his office. When it ended, he turned off the TV and stared out at the desert dusk. He didn't smile, but his shoulders eased. Outrage had done its work. Now, reckoning had to follow. The aide stepped in quietly. "Sir, the Pentagon approved your proposal for joint training sessions." Cross nodded. "Good. Let's make the first one in Pine Creek." The aide hesitated. "You think she'll attend?" Cross replied, "She needs to." He meant all of them. By the time night fell, the hashtag Route 17 had faded from trending lists, replaced by new noise. But in classrooms, church basements, and precinct conference rooms, people were still talking, still replaying the pause between commands, the quiet that followed, the look on one man's face when calm defeated arrogance. Outrage had burned hot. Now it had left light behind. And under that light, both of them, soldier and officer, began to see what truth actually demanded. It wasn't apology, it was endurance. 3 months had passed since the heat on Route 17 baked its lesson into the asphalt. Summer had given way to early fall. The same highway now shimmered under softer light, and the cottonwoods along the ditches had started to rustle yellow. The noise had faded. No more cameras outside Pine Creek's courthouse. No more anchors rehearsing outrage. But something had settled into the air, like dust after a storm. People were still talking, just in quieter rooms. General David Cross parked at the Pine Creek Community Center that morning, the building chosen for the first session of Project Common Ground. He stepped out in plain clothes, not uniform. He'd insisted on that. No medals, no stripes, he'd told the organizers. This isn't about rank. Inside, folding chairs formed a half circle. The smell of burnt coffee and fresh paint lingered. Volunteers had spent the week covering cracks in the plaster, trying to make the space look neutral. A small sign by the door read, "Joint Training and Community Dialogue. Respect in Practice." Cross stood at the edge of the room, watching officers file in. Nervous, stiff, pretending not to recognize him. Then came the sound of hesitant footsteps behind him. Officer Karen Doyle paused in the doorway, her hair tied back, wearing civilian clothes. Her posture was rigid enough to betray the fear she was trying to hide. The room went still for half a breath. The coordinator, an older black woman from the Department of Justice, stepped forward. Let's begin. The first hour passed with policy talk and legal terminology. Cross spoke little, listening as trainers outlined new procedures for roadside communication. He noticed how every example tiptoed around the obvious. When his turn came, he stood, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Paperwork will not fix perception," he said. "We can train forms all day, but if a person sees threat before they see humanity, the form won't stop their hand." His voice wasn't loud. It simply filled the space the way truth tends to. A few officers shifted uneasily. Doyle stared at the floor. During the break, coffee cups clinked and murmurs filled the hallway. Cross stepped outside for air. The wind smelled of dust and distant rain. Behind him came a voice, quiet, brittle. "General Cross?" He turned. Doyle stood there, hands shoved into her jacket pockets. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Didn't have a choice," she replied. Then corrected herself. "No, that's not true. I needed to." She hesitated, searching for a sentence big enough to hold regret. "I've watched that video more times than I can count. Every time, I think I understand less about what I was trying to prove." Cross nodded once. "Understanding isn't a finish line," he said. "It's a start." She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "I told myself I was following protocol." "Protocol doesn't breathe," he said. "People do." For a moment, neither spoke. Cars hissed along the nearby road, the same sound that had started it all. Doyle finally asked, "Why didn't you call for her to be fired?" Cross shook his head. "Because punishment isn't education, and if we don't learn, we'll be right back here, just different names." She swallowed hard. "You're a better person than me." He almost smiled. "No, I just learned earlier what pride costs." The simplicity of the words disarmed her more than anger ever could. Inside, the second session began, role-playing scenarios between officers and veterans. Doyle volunteered first. Her hands trembled slightly as she acted out a traffic stop with one of the trainers. She followed every step by the book, tone steady, posture respectful. When it ended, the trainer said, "What changed?" Doyle answered, "I started hearing myself." The room stayed silent a moment. Then someone murmured, "That's the point." Later, Cross addressed the group again, using no notes. "We keep saying this is about training, but training is just memory with repetition. What we need is empathy with repetition." He gestured toward Doyle without naming her. "We all have moments when our pride outruns our purpose. The test is whether we stop running." A young rookie officer raised his hand. "Sir, how do you forgive something that still makes you angry?" Cross thought for a long time. "You don't start with forgiveness," he said. "You start with accountability. Forgiveness comes when the truth finally feels heavier than the anger. That line spread quietly across the department. By evening, someone had posted it on the precinct bulletin board. Reporters didn't cover this session. No cameras, no noise, just 30 people learning the shape of humility. A week later, the Pentagon approved wider funding for Project Common Ground. Other counties requested the training materials. Cross traveled to D.C. again to debrief. The deputy secretary asked, "Do you think it's working?" Cross replied, "It's starting to." The deputy pressed, "You think people will forget?" "They shouldn't," Cross said. Forgetting is comfort disguised as healing. Back in Pine Creek, Doyle returned to patrol under supervision. The first day felt like walking through a mirror. Every stop made her pulse race. Every conversation reminded her that power had to be earned, not asserted. At one intersection, an elderly driver thanked her for being patient. She nodded, blinking fast. Later that night, she wrote in her report, "Respect is a habit, not a reaction." She taped the note inside her locker. Cross, meanwhile, visited the small memorial marker on Route 17, installed quietly by local veterans. It bore no names, only the inscription, "Respect starts here." He stood there as traffic hummed by, the same endless rhythm of tires and wind. For the first time, the memory didn't taste like anger. It tasted like work unfinished. He knew he'd spend the rest of his career turning outrage into policy, and policy into culture. When he returned to the base that evening, his aide asked if he wanted to rest. Cross shook his head. "We'll rest when respect stops needing reminders." The aide smiled faintly. "That might take a while, sir." "Then we better keep busy," Cross said. And so reckoning didn't arrive with applause or punishment. It arrived with repetition, with small changes written into routine, with one officer learning humility and one general choosing patience over pride. Pine Creek would still have its arguments. The country would still find new ones. But every training manual printed that year started with a quote from General David Cross. "Authority without empathy is just fear with a badge." The words weren't meant for history. They were meant for practice. And on some quiet Texas afternoon, years later, when a rookie pulled someone over on that same stretch of road, the memory of that line, passed down, repeated, and remembered, not for last actions, but for practice, remembered, would keep another conversation from turning into a confrontation. ... Winter came softly to Pine Creek, bringing quiet where noise used to live. The highway where everything started now stretched clean under a pale sky. The air cooler, the colors muted. The old scorch marks were gone, washed out by rain and months of traffic. People still slowed down when they passed the small roadside marker that read, "Respect starts here." But fewer cameras stopped to film it. I was fine with General David Cross. The lesson wasn't for the lens anymore. It was for whoever needed to remember why restraint can sometimes roar louder than defiance. In Washington, the Defense Department issued its yearly ethics report. For the first time, Project Common Ground appeared as a national initiative. Cross's name was printed in small letters near the bottom, a footnote to policy, which was exactly where he wanted it. He'd never liked being anyone's symbol. Still, when he walked through the halls of Fort Bliss now, young soldiers greeted him differently. They looked him in the eye a little longer, as if his calm that day had become part of their training too. Some saluted sharper, some just nodded. He accepted both with the same slight smile. One afternoon, he sat in his office, staring at the sun setting over the desert. The light hit the wall where a frame hung, a printout of a letter from a cadet who'd written, "You taught me that dignity is the loudest command." Beneath it was the note he'd taped months ago. "Authority without empathy is just fear with a badge." He read it again, realizing it applied to more than uniforms. It was about every form of power. Titles, ranks, even the invisible kind that hides in assumption. Back in Pine Creek, Karen Doyle's world had shrunk and steadied. She'd completed retraining, rejoined the department quietly, and spent most of her shifts doing community outreach. It was the chief's idea, though she suspected it was also a test. Every Friday, she visited local schools to talk about safety and trust. The first time, the kids asked about the video. The second time, they asked about respect. She told them, "It's what you give before you think someone's earned it." A teacher later said she sounded like someone who'd lived that sentence. Maybe she had. At night, Doyle sometimes replayed that day in her mind. Not the words. She'd long since forgotten the exact phrasing, but the look on Cross's face when he told her, "Protocol doesn't breathe. People do." It stayed with her. It changed how she approached strangers, how she spoke to dispatch, how she saw herself in the mirror. Redemption, she'd learned, wasn't a speech. It was repetition. Every respectful act was a small repayment toward balance. In February, the first statewide summit on community policing was held in Boston. Cross attended as a speaker. Doyle attended as a participant. Their names weren't listed together, but fate rarely checks programs. The organizers placed them in the same discussion circle. When she entered the room, she hesitated at the doorway again, just like months ago at the training center. Cross noticed and offered a nod. She walked over, sat down 2 chairs away. The moderator asked each attendee to share one thing they'd learned since the incident. When it was her turn, Doyle said that the badge reflects who you are before it commands anyone else. Cross followed with, that patience can be protest. The moderator smiled. The audience clapped softly, not for spectacle, but for recognition. Afterward, Doyle approached him in the hallway. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I go where the work is," he replied. She looked at him for a long moment. "You changed how I think about power." He shook his head. "Power changes people all the time. You just decided to notice." She exhaled, almost a laugh. "Guess that's progress." "Guess so," he said. That night, Cross took the late flight back to El Paso. From the airplane window, the world below looked peaceful. Towns scattered like small constellations, highways like thin ribbons of light. He thought about how many stories never reach this kind of closure. How many names never make it past hashtags. He thought about his daughter, who'd once told him, "Dad, you can't fix the world. You can just show it the right angle." Maybe that's all he'd done, tilted the mirror enough for people to see themselves clearly for a second. Back in Pine Creek, the precinct walls had new posters. "Listen first. Respect always." They weren't slogans. They were reminders. The department hired a community liaison, the same veteran who'd first reported the footage. On slow afternoons, Doyle helped him update training slides. One day he asked, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" She thought about it. "Every day," she said, "and also not at all." He nodded. That's what growth sounds like. As spring approached, the desert bloomed again. Wildflowers pushed through cracks along Route 17, yellow and stubborn. Travelers who didn't know the story sometimes stopped to take photos. never realizing they were standing where a lesson once burned into the air. For the locals, the scene had become part of memory, painful but useful, like a scar that warned you what not to repeat. One evening, Cross returned to that spot. No escort, no ceremony, just his pickup, parked by the shoulder as the sun dropped low. He stood by the marker, tracing the engraved words with one hand. A car passed, horn honking in greeting. He raised a hand in return. The air smelled of warm dust and diesel. He closed his eyes, not to forget, but to remember differently. The sound of the highway blended with the wind until it felt like one long exhale. He thought of Doyle, of the countless officers who would learn from her mistake, of the soldiers who'd written him letters, of the country still arguing with itself, but for once, listening too. Change, he realized, doesn't roar, it echoes. It repeats through small actions until the next generation can't tell where the old silence used to be. When he finally turned to leave, the horizon flared orange, lighting the edges of the road like a promise. Behind him, the plaque caught that same light, the words glowing for a second before fading back into bronze. Respect starts here. And maybe it did. Maybe it always will.